The Quest, a textual and archaeological look at the foundations of our faith. This series of programs deals with the topic, the Jewish Jesus. And now, our host for The Quest, Hebrew Studies scholar, biblical historian, and archaeologist, Dr. Roy Blizzard.
Shalom and welcome once again to The Quest. We're going to be sharing with you, as we've mentioned, many exciting things in this special series that we've designed with one overriding purpose in mind, to help bring us all to a better and more accurate understanding of Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings. Our approach in this program, as we mentioned, is going to be threefold. First of all, we're going to be looking at the latest in biblical research and education, talking with some of the world's top scholars in the area of textual and biblical research. Then secondly, we're going to be going to Israel and observing a number of archaeological excavations and sites, revealing many exciting facts which will enhance our understanding of the biblical text and the time and culture in which Jesus of Nazareth lived. And then finally, we're going to be examining individual verses of Scripture which for centuries have caused confusion, not just for the church, but for the general public as well. The subject of our first 13 programs is the Jewish Jesus. This is our second program, and we're continuing in our program today in our discussion with Dr. Robert Lindsay. Dr. Robert Lindsay, as we mentioned, is an expert in the words of Jesus and in the Hebrew language. And he has his BA degree from the University of Oklahoma in Classical Greek, a Master's of Theology from Princeton Theological Seminary, and his PhD from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Lindsay is currently pastor of the Narcus Street Baptist Congregation in Jerusalem and has lived in that country for over 40 years. He is considered to be one of the most eminent scholars in the world, and Dr. Lindsay, it's a pleasure again to welcome you to The Quest. Now, we were discussing in our last program the Jewish Jesus, and you made a statement in which you said that one of the most important things for us to understand about the Jewish Jesus was that at a very early age he studied the Scriptures, the Old Testament, committed most of this material to memory, and that he studied it in Hebrew and that he spoke Hebrew. Now this basically runs counter to everything that most students in our Bible colleges and seminaries have been taught for about the last 150 years. On what basis do you make that statement?
Well, first of all, I think you have to realize that a kind of legend developed about the whole subject of the language which we call Aramaic. Aramaic is a Semitic language. It was the language that people were speaking in Babylon when the Jews were taken captive there. And when they returned to the land after 70 years, it was supposed by scholars for a long, long time they must have brought the language with them, brought Aramaic back as a principal language. There were many Jews later on in Babylon and that area who did use Aramaic as their main language. But those that came back in after 70 years were apparently still speaking Hebrew, even in their homes all that time. And so what we really have is a kind of misunderstanding. It has been supposed that Aramaic was the main language. There are many reasons to think that it was not. Dr. Frank Cross, for example, says that there are very good reasons to think that the people coming back from Babylon spread out around the Judean hills in that area. We have many of the names of the villages where they went, and that their main language was Hebrew and continued to be Hebrew. There are many other reasons to think that there was Hebrew. Hebrew was a spoken language, somewhat modified from the old biblical kind of Hebrew, but still very, very real Hebraic language. We have in the New Testament many little hints of this. I can give a great many such suggestions, but One, for example, and one that I found early in working with the Gospels, was the simple fact that a number of Hebrew words appear under a kind of the Greek range of meaning in many places. For example, we have one in the 23rd chapter of Matthew, the first 2 or 3 verses. Jesus says, the scribes and the Pharisees, and we have a translation, sit on the seat of Moses. And that is a present tense. But the Greek says, is an aorist tense. It means sat. The scribes and Pharisees sat on Moses' seat. And whatever they say to you and to do, do. But don't act like them. Now, the point of the whole thing is that word sit is not a direct translation of the aorist. It should be sat. But if you say sat, everybody would know that the translation would be meaningless. So you have to say, if you're really going to get closer to the truth of it, you should translate the aorist, which is not normal and wouldn't be correct, Greek speaking. You would have to say, the scribes and Pharisees have sat down. Now, this is an old Hebrew idiom. To take over the seat of Moses is to sit down on the seat. But you then have to use the perfect. The minute you put the Greek text back into Hebrew, the perfect tense and the Hebrew idiom comes out beautifully. And we say simply this: the scribes and the Pharisees have taken over the authority of Moses. That's what it means. And the very use of the tenses in the Greek can be explained only on the basis of an original Hebrew. There are many, many such things.
What was it that led you in your studies to come to this conclusion?
Well, I was working on the Gospel of Mark. And when I began translating the Gospel of Mark to Hebrew, I was working on a new translation I started many years ago, and back in 1959, actually. And as I was translating the Greek text of the Gospel of Mark, I noticed that the Greek had a word order that was like Hebrew. Now, I did my studies in a classical Greek originally, and classical Greek is a particular kind of language that has it has a case system for the nouns. It has a highly developed verbal system. The case system means that you can look at a word in its ending and tell how it should be translated in any given place or in any given spot in the text. However, in ancient Greek, because of this, you could put your words in the sentence anywhere you wanted to. Now, Hebrew is like English. English has to have a certain word order, or we don't understand what things mean. We therefore use a certain kind of word order. And so does Hebrew. And if you don't have that word order, you're lost, because you don't have a case system at the end of your nouns as one of the... We have prepositions in Hebrew and in English. We have practically a very few prepositions in many ways in the ordinary text of ancient classical Greek. And later on it began to develop with prepositions. In the text of your Greek text of the New Testament, we find many developing prepositions. In other words, you can take the Hebrew preposition and match it to the Greek text. So you translate your Greek text, and you're getting prepositions, you're getting other kinds of things, word order. That's just like Hebrew. That's what I found in the Gospel of Mark. I had some other problems later. I began to see that there were Greek texts or Greek words that didn't fit Hebrew, but these were incidental sort of things. The basic word order was Hebraic. It was a Greek text with Greek words, but the Hebrew was there. And so it was in Matthew and in Luke. Again and again, I can take any person who wishes to listen to it, take the Greek text and show these Hebrew types of writing. When you put it back into Hebrew, you get good text.
In other words, the Greek is poor Greek. That actually what it is Hebrew in Greek dress.
That's exactly right.
Now, that raises an interesting question, and that is that we have many Greek scholars that are well acquainted with the New Testament in Greek. How is it that they have not recognized that this material was Hebrew?
Well, in my own experience, I had been using Hebrew for many years, preaching in it, speaking in it in my own congregation in Jerusalem. and working on translations of books from English to Hebrew with people that were experts in Hebrew. And so in my own experience, I felt these things because I was a Hebrew speaker. The average person who learns English is like me when I first learned Greek. Who learns English, who learns Greek, I'm saying. The average person who learns Greek as an English speaker learns it from an English point of view. That's the way I learned Greek to begin with. And I early discovered in trying to translate classical Greek that I have had a lot of trouble because I couldn't put it easily into flowing English. And the same thing happened in Hebrew when I was working. Now, I don't expect and don't think that very many people would have my experience. Very, very few. Some Jewish people living in Jerusalem and speaking Hebrew would be people who would be more like me, and I eventually did find people that helped me along this line because they knew both Greek and Hebrew.
And so actually the key is knowing not just the Greek, but you have to know the Hebrew as well. Do many scholars in Israel today recognize this as being the fact?
Well, there are a number of such scholars in Jerusalem and in Israel, but as a matter of fact, most of the scholars who write about the Bible live not in Jerusalem and do not think of Hebrew as being reflected behind the Greek text of the Gospels.
Well, I realize that's true across the country as a whole, but just in Israel itself and among the Israeli scholars who are working with the New Testament text in the words of Jesus, is this a general consensus of opinion among them?
Any Hebrew-speaking person who picks up a Greek text and starts to work with Greek will see the Hebraic underlie of the thing.
I just want to confirm what you're saying in an interesting experience that I had here at the University of Texas a number of years ago when I first started my Hebrew studies. I had been taught, of course, in college that the language of the New Testament was Greek, and one day one of the professors at the university, just quite out of the clear blue and in no context in anything that we were studying, mentioned something about the New Testament being Hebrew and the language of Jesus Hebrew. And so another student and I cornered him after the class was over and said, didn't you make a mistake? Didn't you intend to say Greek or Hebrew? And he was quite amazed that anybody had ever thought that it was Greek in the first place. As a matter of fact, he found it difficult to believe that anybody had ever thought that it was Greek in the first place, and he did not even know of this Greek theory.
But he was probably a Jewish person.
Oh, he was an Israeli.
Israeli who knew Hebrew.
Yes, an Israeli who was teaching at the University in the Hebrew Studies program, and he had never even been introduced to this whole idea of the...
Yes, it's very easy to take an Israeli, show him the Greek text, and start translating word by word into Hebrew, and say, oh, that sounds like Hebrew.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lindsay. Now, in our last biblical field report, we concluded with the statement that at the age of 30, Jesus began his earthly ministry by going into the wilderness to be baptized by John the Baptist. The desolate area of the Judean wilderness near the Dead Sea held a special significance for a large group of spiritually oriented Jews of Jesus' day, which settled there in the community known as Qumran. Now, we can learn a great deal about Jesus, and in particular about what language he spoke, by studying this mysterious community from which came one of the most significant textual discoveries of our time, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the spring of 1947, Bedouin shepherds, tending their flocks among the rocky crags near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, accidentally discovered a small cave high up on the side of a cliff. Within the cave they found 9 jars, all empty, with the exception of one, which contained 3 old scrolls. Upon closer examination by experts, it was discovered that one of the scrolls was the complete book of Isaiah, written over 2,000 years ago. The impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as they're called, on biblical, historical, and linguistic scholarship was revolutionary. Soon after the initial discovery at cave number 1, excavations began here at Qumran, and we've since been able to determine a great deal about this strange and even mysterious Jewish sect. We know that the members of this settlement came here around the end of the 2nd century BC, where they constructed a highly developed collective community. The members of this sect were extremely religious and devoted much of their time to copying and preserving their sacred scrolls. On the site today, we see only the ruins of their once vibrant community, which included a library, an assembly hall, storehouses, and an elaborate water storage system. Here in the heart of the Qumran community, we see the scriptorium, the very room in which many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. Along the eastern wall was a large table, and on that table the scrolls were actually written by hand. Here in our excavations, the archaeologists even found the ink wells containing dried ink made of animal gall and lampblack. Eventually, some 37 caves were examined in the immediate area. 7 complete or nearly complete scrolls were found, as well as tens of thousands of scroll fragments, representing every book in the Old Testament with the exception of Esther. Most of the scrolls are almost identical in content to the biblical text as we have it today. Other scrolls are original works composed by and for the community itself. But what significance do these Dead Sea Scrolls have toward our understanding of the Jewish Jesus of the 1st century, and in particular the language that he spoke? To properly answer this question, it's necessary for us to look at the scrolls themselves. The Dead Sea Scrolls are today housed at the magnificent Shrine of the Book, or Heichal HaSefer, here in Jerusalem. The architect designed the Shrine of the Book to carry out the theme of one of the scrolls, a scroll that prophetically proclaims a coming war between the sons of darkness and the sons of light.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1946 or 47, were originally discovered in one cave, and the cave produced originally 7 scrolls. Now we have 11 caves with some 700 scrolls. One should remember that not all the scrolls, as a matter of fact, the majority of the scrolls aren't well preserved, but still this is a real library with a wealth of knowledge dating back to the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Mostly there are some earlier pieces there. We started with one site, now we have half a dozen sites, but the Dead Sea Scrolls alone are the greatest archaeological discovery ever made in this country. They are written on parchment, mostly animal leather, untanned leather. There are remains of much bigger library, but as I say, so well preserved that they give us a good representation of the original library of the community that lived there on the shores of the Dead Sea at that time, a time which is of great importance for Jews. That's the very end of the Second Commonwealth, and certainly very important for Christians, because this is the time of the ministry of St. John the Baptist and Jesus. When I'm asked what is the most important single thing, I would find it very difficult to say, because of the variety of the things that have been discovered there. About 200 out of the 700 manuscripts are Old Testament manuscripts, twice as old as any manuscripts that we had so far, which means also that some of the manuscripts are pretty close to the time of composition. This is a single topic that I took out of the whole lot to show how important scholarly and emotionally is the fact that we have here manuscripts so close to their time of composition, and to our great surprise, almost identical to the books that we possess now, which is a great thing when we come to think of it, that the manuscripts that we are using now have been copied and recopied for about 2,000 years. Another great point of great importance is in understanding the background of Christianity. After all, it's an undeniable fact that Christianity originated in Judaism, and Christianity originated among Hebrew and Aramaic-speaking Jews. It so happens that the intertestamental period, the 3 centuries between the Old Testament and the New Testament, were hardly represented in the books that we have in the original. We have translations, but we don't have originals. Now the gap has been filled by that wonderful find.
We all know that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but didn't Jesus speak Aramaic? Well, certainly he knew it, because the people of his day were multilingual. But can the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us anything about the common, everyday language of Jesus and the first century Jew in Palestine? We know that the members of the Dead Sea community, in addition to copying biblical manuscripts, also wrote a number of original books, such as the Manual of Discipline for New Initiates, intended only for members of their community. Of the 10 major non-biblical scrolls published to date, only 1 is in Aramaic, and the others, including the recently published Temple Scroll, are all written in Hebrew.
The most important scroll now that hasn't yet been published and is going to be published soon is most probably a letter written by the founder of the sect to his adversaries, the Pharisees. This is a manuscript that has been preserved in 6 copies. Very fragmentary, but having 6, they are added together into quite a coherent text of 120 lines. And this letter is written in Hebrew, in very good Hebrew, classical Hebrew, which shows that that was a living language. I mean, it is small wonder if people use sacred books in their original language. But it is very enlightening to show that even the correspondence is carried out in Hebrew.
These sectarian scrolls are significant in the discussion of the literary language of the first century, since they are not simply copies of biblical texts composed hundreds of years earlier, but original writings composed entirely in a period contemporary with Jesus. Also of great significance are the numerous psharim, or commentaries, found here at Qumran. These commentaries cover a number of books, as well as scattered pages throughout the Old Testament. Since the study of Scripture was expected of all Jews, it is highly unlikely that a commentary on the Scriptures would be written in anything other than a language that the majority of the people could understand. Because of the overwhelming evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as numerous other archaeological and textual discoveries, the majority of scholarship here in Israel is in agreement. The dominant language of the first century in Palestine, and hence the common language of Jesus, was not Aramaic nor Greek, but Hebrew. And in no better place can we see this demonstrated than here at Qumran and in the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I want to keep emphasizing this fact that the language of Jesus was Hebrew. And not only was the language of Jesus Hebrew, but another point, that in his teaching he's always alluding back to certain passages of Scripture familiar to his hearers. Now there is an interesting incident recorded for us in two places in the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 7, verse 33, and he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears, and he spit, and he touched his tongue. And then in Mark chapter 8, verse 23, and he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of town, and when he had spit in his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw. And here's an interesting incident in which we see Jesus not only alluding to Scripture, but where our gospel writers, Mark, and also we have a similar incident recorded in John where Jesus takes spittle and clay and anoints the man's eyes, tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, alludes to certain customs that were current in Jesus' day as well. I have here a little book called Every Man's Talmud that's a condensation of Mishnaic and Talmudic literature, and it says on page 253, "For eye trouble, spittle was commonly used, but we are told there is a tradition that the spittle of the firstborn son of a father has healing powers, but not the firstborn son of the mother." And so we see in Mark and in John that there is perhaps this allusion to this tradition or custom of Jesus' day in which they're trying to demonstrate that he was indeed the firstborn son of the Father. Well, I want to again thank Dr. Lindsay and tell you that in tomorrow's program we're going to be talking with another scholar from Israel, Mr. David Biven, about the Aramaic and Greek theories of the origin of our synoptic Gospels. And in our biblical field report we're going to be going to Masada, and we'll be discussing another interesting passage of Scripture from the Gospel of Matthew. Join us again, won't you, here on The Quest. God bless.